I'm so happy to be talking to you, François and Cynthia, about your incredible new book, which I have read and reread and have found a work that has really crystallized a lot of things that I've been grappling with myself. And because of that struggle that I've had to try to define some of the challenges that you talk about in the book and understand them better, maybe you can tell me why you wrote the book. Why did you write this book? What brought you to the book?
The inception of the book was probably 10 years in the making, 8-10 years in the making. Francois and I met at the Bertha Center for Social Innovation in Cape Town. And both of us had had a history of working in areas of social change. And both of us kind of came into this time period at the University of Cape Town and in South Africa with a bit of frustration with the work that we were doing, probably also a lot of fear. We felt that the work that we were doing wasn't having always the impact that we wanted it to have. And we were worried about some of the implications for some of the work that we were doing. But at the same time, at the Bertha Center, we were bringing together and we were seeing people come into the business school through the Bertha Center, people that were using different techniques, different tactics for social change, things that we felt were really kind of trying to address issues of social justice, issues of power. And we were, seeing these things happen in a business school, which was kind of worlds colliding. And we were intrigued to see if this was something that we could really explore further. The issues that we were seeing grappling with in South Africa were not necessarily the conversations that we were having, though, in the global north. In some of the conferences that we were attending, this term of systems change was coming to the fore in these kind of larger conversations, but we felt that the work on the ground in South Africa was far different. It had elements of relational work. It had elements of power reconfiguration that we didn't feel were really being talked about at the highest levels. So this was really the issues that we wanted to address in the book, but it took us a long time because we really had to uncover a lot, kind of dig through the work that was being done at the surface level and try and identify the things that were happening that were really making a true impact on the ground.
I think, going back a decade, as Cynthia said, and starting the Bertha Center was actually quite naive, thinking that one could have a solutionist mindset to a country that has 400 years of colonialism, institutionalized oppression, macroeconomic global economies working against its favor, a resource-based economy, some of the largest inequality in the world. Social entrepreneurship solutions were really not going to uncover and get to the depths of some of that. But then when we started looking, the work that was being done was not really what we were talking about in the world of social innovation, social entrepreneurship. And I think there was, an emergence of, we really don't know what we're doing, to saying, but there are people who have been doing deep work for many years and working on what we now globally quite understand as systemic inequalities or structural inequalities, and working on it in a way that was substantive, long-term, but often hidden. And so, it was a journey of, Cynthia and I sat around and said, even if we just learn from this kind of journey we take in writing this together, that will be, the starting point, and it would have been worth it. And we're just delighted that we're able to share the stories of others and bring to the conversation, we feel, what at one point the book was called, the hidden work.
Fantastic, yeah. And that is one of the things that I think makes your book stand out, is the fact that you were listening to innovators and who are doing that deep hidden work that was not being defined at global conferences and acknowledged necessarily for what it was, and that brought you to these new definitions and clearer definitions, in my opinion. So maybe what you could talk a bit about what you mean by systems work and how it's different from the way we were talking, in that sort of solutionist, industrial sort of approach to social change and systems change, to what you mean as systems work.
One of the things that we decided to do in the early stages of writing was to go and do an historical review of what do we mean by social change? How has this concept emerged over about 200 years? We had to go back that far. And we initially went back 100 years, and then we went back another 100 years. And we thought, is this something we really want to spend time on in the book? It takes up a whole chapter. And in fact, we decided it does. It's important that we understand the roots of what we are doing and how it's changed over time, the terminology that we use and the approaches that we use. So the turning point really is at the end of World War II. And this is where essentially the mindset shifted from a progressive kind of local-based set of activities that were focused on social change and really started to take on the industrial mindset that we see as so ubiquitous in the social change industry, is what we call it today. And we felt that it was important to go back that far and really see what are the terms that we're using, why are we using them, why are we approaching things in the way that we are approaching them, just so that we can go a little bit deeper and see what we have lost in that process. And what we discovered that has been lost is really the relational approaches to social change. So when we talk about outcomes, when we talk about outputs, when we talk about the things that we want to achieve with our social change work, we often focus on the end goal. And that gets us, that allows us to achieve quite a lot, but we miss something along the way, which is the process of social change. So we kind of took a turn there and we said, let's look at the process. What's the work that we do on a day-to-day basis? How do we do it? How do we do it in relationship with each other? And does that give us a different lens to look at social change? And we really feel that it does. Unfortunately, though, it's not the social change work that's often talked about in funding proposals or in the marketing pieces that get pushed out after a social change effort is, quote unquote, successful. We talk about the outputs and the outcomes, but we don't talk about the process to get there. And so we lose the ability to fund those very concrete activities that are happening on a day-to-day basis.
If I can add in the conversation of systems change on top of that. So that was taking that same kind of mindset philosophy and just putting that on steroids and say, okay, well, now we just want a bigger outcome, and so really for us getting frustrated with that conversation because, there wasn't much and still, is emerging. What do people mean by that? There's a huge heterogeneity around what people mean by that. You get very different answers, and yet it's used in our dialogues and our framing more and more. And so I think we wanted to, get beyond, okay, well, systems change in 50 years time, or that it's happening every day, right through to actually it's about the way we work that's going to be to get to the outcomes that we're aspiring to, that we're talking about, that we're sometimes having aspirational dreams about, but it actually starts here and now. And so I think the term work really focused on what we need to do, not what we need to talk about.
So true. And you both have some wonderful examples of and some great redefinition of that, going from scale, my widget times a million, pushed out the industrial approach to really more these economies of trust. You talk about bonding and bridging capital, those relationships that you mentioned, Cynthia. And maybe we could talk about some of those wonderful examples, whether it's Bertzog or FII, our labs, Mothers to Mothers. So I don't know if you want to maybe cite a couple of examples to illustrate what you mean by those, that process as opposed to big outcome.
Sure. And I think it's important to realize that these process activities do achieve great and wonderful and big outcomes. And in fact, this idea of scale has become our guiding mantra in so many of our social change circles. But to get to scale, the activities that we need to do need to be grounded in good and strong and trusting relationships. So the principles that we kind of emerged with after spending quite a bit of time with many different social change organizations, social purpose organizations that were doing this work. The first of those is foster connection. And really, in systems terms, this means that you change if you can change the way a person or an organization relates to another person or an organization, you can change the system. So at its very most concrete level, fostering connection is about putting people in contact with one another who would not be in contact with one another otherwise, and keeping them together while they are learning through the change so that they can adapt and learn together. And some of the concrete examples, the first of those being Mothers to Mothers. You know, in the example of Mothers to Mothers, this is an organization that has done a wonderful job of putting women in contact with women who would not be in otherwise community with one another. And because they both have this common bond of motherhood, and oftentimes the common bond of living with HIV, they are able to connect in a way that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And that changes the trajectory of a mother and her baby. So by putting those two women in conversation with one another and then having a community around them, you can change the outcomes for outcomes of health for a family. The second of our principles is around embracing context. And this is where we really started to look at scale. We said, why are so many organizations trying to use economies of scale to replicate their efforts and failing? Why is it that we do these very small, wonderful pilot projects that achieve great outcomes, and then we try and do it over and over again in different contexts and we fail? And we realize that it's because oftentimes we're then removing the relational elements because those aren't the elements that we seek to scale. We seek to scale the technical elements. But to scale relationships, you actually have to empower and put in positions of decision making those people who are on the ground who can make day-to-day adaptations to the program. And so a wonderful example of this is Buurtzorg, which is an organization based out of Amsterdam, but working globally with neighborhood teams of nurses who are integrally involved in their communities and understand on a day-to-day basis what their patients need and what the families need and what the communities have to offer. And they act as those kind of adaptive teams going in and helping families achieve great health outcomes. And then the third principle is around reconfiguration of power. And when we talk about reconfiguration of power, that it's such a loaded term, power. I mean, how do we actually do this? But we saw that in organizations, and I'll give the example of NEDAN, it's not just about putting a policy in place that gets people who are formerly marginalized into positions of positional power, but also about ensuring that the places where their voices are being heard or where their voices are being needed, that they are in those positions on a long-term basis over time. And doing that requires a lot of post-policy work. So you can make a policy where suddenly you've now got, in the case of NEDAN, a town vending committee where a street vendor is now sitting in a position of power to help enforce municipal policies, but also ensuring that that person feels that they can speak up, that they can ensure that the things that they need are put on the table, and ensuring that that town vending committee becomes a real voice in municipal politics going forward. So NEDAN is an organization that did a great job pushing forward this policy through a lot of activist work, but then had to really get into the nitty-gritty and figure out, well, how do you make these town vending committees really work on the ground? So those are the three principles that emerged in the book, and then we go into kind of the practices on how that happens on a day-to-day basis as the book unfolds.
Right, and another example I thought was very powerful, this does speak maybe to the global scaling, again, fraught term, but this global scaling is SDI, right? Slumdwellers International, where they're really develop those relationships and power dynamics are addressed locally, but then also connections are made between the different coalitions to advocate, again, with that same kind of power dynamic globally.
In some ways, there is a long history of community organizing, large-scale cooperative federations that is built into kind of the DNA of SDI. And yet it also, in a way, has provided, along the principles that Cynthia spoke about, a bit of a shift in, and certainly in my own mind is, what is the purpose of nonprofit, social sector, social enterprise organizations? Is it to deliver goods and services, in this case, to people who live in slums and townships and favelas? Or actually, is it a very different model where it is, the purpose is about the creation of the relationships, right? The creation of structures that allows a self-determination along the lines of what Mirai Chatterjee, who wrote the foreword in our book, saying we need to kind of relearn the lessons of Gandhi in a way for modern organizations. And, you know, and we see some of that in SDI, where they are, you know, whenever SDI gets on a stage anywhere, whether it's in a council meeting or in a global conference, it is a representative that has been elected from somewhere in the world, and that is connected to the movement and representative of the movement in a way that we don't see often enough anymore. And I think, you know, that there is a philosophy there, there's a methodology there that is also then used with local mapping, with reporting, but done by the local community, which might not be even, it's an SDI affiliate normally, right, that is based and has emerged, but they've connected this through this large network. So they have a council of federations, which really serves as a platform. And I know you want to talk a little bit about platform versus network, so we can get into that. And so they're able to have representativity on, you know, global decision-making bodies, on places where they're advocating either nationally or globally. And so what that's doing is taking, you know, our presumption about participatory methodologies, our presumptions around who can really be in a global conference and what level of education they need to have to a very different level, because they've proven over and again through their ways of creating channels and councils and representativity for them to advocate for their own interests rather than, you know, having someone else advocate it on their behalf. And so it's been, you know, it's quite a humbling experience as well to think that this reconfiguration of power isn't only about donors and NGOs, it's also about the social sector and who we're working with and for. And so there is a bigger critique that is, obviously we're not the only book to recognize and talk about, you know, how have we got here and what is this industry of social change that we're somehow all part of, actually partly complicit in, and that, you know, one of our big concerns coming into this space and concerns about systems change work is that if actors of power are the ones redesigning systems, they, you know, we're perpetuating a lot of what already exists, and we may not get different configurations.
Well, yes, Francois, that is definitely one of the key elements of the book. And so if we talk about the, let's say, foxes who are guarding the chicken coop, no matter how well-intentioned they are, what is it that needs to change? And specifically, let's talk about the philanthropist piece of that, and what kinds of mindsets and practices do philanthropists need to embrace in order to have that system change?
I mean, I think there has been obviously quite a lot of introspection in the philanthropic community. I think there has been the conversations and spaces to address the power dynamics. And I think a lot of that is coming to questions around trust, longer term funding, the processes themselves, what are we actually holding? You know, we're trying to hold people to account and think about performance, and yet we're actually holding back the real work. So I think that conversation exists out there. I think what we've tried to do is to recognize what that work is, and create a space and maybe a terminology and a frame of thinking for organizations to go and have conversations with their funders to say, you know, the work we do that is perhaps less tangible to you, which we may not have something to report on in terms of outputs or outcomes in a year's time, is actually the fundamental deeper work that is actually going to sustain this in the long term, or that is really going to lead to some of these shifts. And so giving them, you know, a language and a framing and an affirmation. We've had so many people come back to us having read the book and say, now I understand, you know, how to talk about this with my funder, or to say why we didn't continue working with a particular funder and a partner, because they didn't recognize or believe in that work that we did, and yet we believed in it. So it's been really interesting to hear that from around the world now. And so I think, you know, we want to contribute to the conversation that I think is already happening, but recognize also, you know, that many funders are institutionally set up and structurally set up and sometimes legally set up to work in quite different ways. And so recognizing that it's a journey that, you know, many are on. I think what we have tried to emphasize is and I guess provide some examples around how the letting go of some of the things that we've held dear, and we've tried to professionalize philanthropy in the last 20 years, have actually perhaps been an obstacle to some of this deeper work. If we want to be thinking about really transformative change and more systemic change.
And I would just add to that, funders and also the organizations that work with social purpose organizations can act in two different ways as systems workers. As supporting actors, they can act in ways that identify the work that is being done that is systems work and supporting it. So you can see if you have the language and the terminology to be able to look at something and say, I want to fund that, and that's something that is important to a systemic outcome. It's fostering connection, or it's embracing context, or it's reconfiguring power. Then that's one level. And then also funders and supporting organizations can also do systems work themselves internally. So I think oftentimes we can see ourselves as outside of the system, like what you were saying, Winthrop, about experts holding clipboards and trying to identify the things that are going to change, or scientists in a lab manipulating variables. And that's absolutely not what we are. We are all part of the system that we are trying to change. We are agents of change, but we are also obstacles to change. So oftentimes when we sit in a system as who we are and don't choose to change, we become the obstacle to change. And so that work of looking internally, of looking introspectively at oneself, but also introspectively at an organization, and saying what needs to change here so that we can be the change we want to see in the world, is extremely important. We saw funding organizations that were having deep conversations internally about how they were going to create participatory ways of making funding decisions, how they were going to devolve, if we can use that term, devolve their funding decisions all the way to the people who were going to be receiving the funds. Those are radical conversations, and they are extremely important to be had if we're going to change the way this power dynamic unfolds in our social change work.
Right, and you mentioned Lankelly Chase in the book as an organization that's done that deep introspective, or a funder that's done that deep introspective work and then changed how they engage with their community.
Yes, they're an organization that had to have a lot of those internal conversations and look at how they were doing their funding, and realize that the funding patterns that they were following were actually not reflective of the work that they wanted to see in the world. They also decided to change their role. So rather than being a grant maker to programs, they decided to be essentially a convener, an organization that seeded new relationships in the world of social change, and ensured that those containers were doing the real work that they wanted to do, which was keeping people in relationship while they adapt to change. And they called it, one of the projects they had was called the Elephant Project. And the reason why they called it that was because the elephant in the room was the fact that these two groups of people could not speak to one another. And they said that the work of getting people into the room to speak to one another in productive ways was the real work that they needed to do. Which is a huge revelation, I think, for them and for other organizations that are trying to create new connections between different types of individuals and organizations.
Absolutely, that's wonderful. Well, why don't we go to the question of platforms? And for many years we've been using the term network, and now you use the word platform, but you use it in a very specific way. And so maybe we could have a brief conversation around platforms versus networks, and how you define platforms in the context of your work.
We were very nervous about using the term platform. I'm not going to lie. We thought, gosh, this is a loaded term. It's being used everywhere. Do we really want to put this in the book? But we realized that what we were seeing were people platforms, not technology platforms. Oftentimes they were enabled by technology, but they had people at the very heart of what they were doing. And the word platform really showed that there was an intentionality to this work, rather than kind of a just bringing together of heterogeneous people. the distinction between the term network and platform that we kind of landed on was the fact that networks do, although they bring together groups of people and their objective is to keep people together, oftentimes it's very agnostic as to who is joining and who comes into the network. It's kind of a spread it far and wide sort of set of activities. Whereas on a platform, what we realized was that there is a true power element at play in platforms. You have the platform provider, and that platform provider really chooses who is going to hook into the platform, who's going to be a part of it, and how those connections are made. So in the case of SDI, we used that term platform because we realized that by ensuring that organizations in different geographies of the world that were having similar issues could meet with one another and have horizontal exchanges, they were creating this platform for learning exchange that was truly intentional. It wasn't about just putting local organizations in touch with higher ups in global organizations. This was about ensuring that people connected on the ground that could learn from each other. The other organization that we looked at in terms of a platform was Child and Youth Finance International, which is an organization that has actually since closed because they feel that they have achieved their goal of connecting those who need to be in connection with one another. But it was a truly intentional set of activities that kept people together so that they could ensure that policies for children and finance were seated in the geographies all around the world. So for us, the term was fraught, but we felt like eventually that we could use it in a way that felt meaningful, particularly if we associated it with people rather than technology. It was that kind of decoupling of those two things that really felt meaningful to us.
I'm going to make an argument for actually how strongly technology did actually feature in so much of our work. And we kind of also debated whether we should have a dedicated chapter on it and decided against it. And we're obviously in our day and age, and we went through COVID and rewrote quite a lot of the book, and part of our thesis was that because of this highly relational work and these principles and practices, that actually these organizations would be quite well placed during COVID because of the trust that they had with the partners and people that they worked with. And we felt to a large degree that hypothesis played out, but to also a large degree, technology has played a big role in how that happens, but a very different kind of reason. It was really about providing that sense of agency and empowerment that we've spoken about for years, but really providing information, data, the ability to connect with peers in the hands of people, so that technology actually helped to shift the power, quite different to the way we're actually seeing technology concentrate power that has also emerged during COVID.
And so in essence, you're talking about the democratization of access to and use of data. So maybe we could delve into that a little more. How do organizations and the communities they support do this?
Yes, I think in one part of the book, we talk about small data and big data. And that reminds me of those distinctions. Small data is the data that we share on a day-to-day basis, just peer-to-peer. So, you're standing in a parking lot and you're sharing, a find that you had at a shop down the road, or you're sharing with someone how you got a mortgage provider to help you with your bond. Each of those kinds of conversations shares data amongst each other so that we can make the next decision in our lives. And Family Independence Initiative, which is now called Up Together, facilitates those small data conversations by creating peer groups in communities of poverty, but ensuring that people are able to share success stories so that they can then propel their lives in the direction that they want to propel them. They use journaling in a technology platform, monthly journaling for people to then take their decisions and look at them on a day-to-day basis and make future decisions. And by sharing those decisions with their peers, they can then make decisions that are going to give them better outcomes. But there's big data as well. And so that organization continues to use big data because they now, with this monthly journaling in an anonymized way, and then with the success stories that are being shared on their global national platform, they can then ensure that people see kind of the trends across a much bigger population. And so big data in the hands of people can be extremely transformational. And sometimes I think we think of big data as just being extracted from us and being used by nameless entities, sometimes in nefarious ways. But actually big data in the hands of people can be used in very positive ways to change the trajectories of communities. So I think it's about harnessing that data, ensuring it's owned and utilized by the people who have who are empowered to change their own communities and lives, where we can really use this technology for good.
That's a great example, Cynthia, of how communities can harness data for their benefit, as opposed to just having data extracted by third parties for their benefit. And that leads me to the question of measurement and evaluation. And in the book, you talk a lot about how it's necessary to go beyond, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, to actually surfacing the very important and often invisible work that is entailed in this systems change work. So can we talk a bit about that?
Yeah, we could have written a whole book on that alone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which we didn't. And I guess we're not measurement experts, but we've been part of that world. And I come from actually doing randomized controlled trials in medicine. So I came initially, very much with evidence-based approaches, and there's a lot to be said and learned from that space. I think what we recognize that was in some ways reinforcing the industrial approach in some way, right? And that in a way it was crowding out the other intangibles, and found really, really interesting things happening in the world that I think we're more supportive of this. So for a long time the work of developmental evaluation has been part of the broader discussion around evaluation, and how seeing evaluation as part of doing social change, as part of the work itself. And we actually argue that part of systems work is that kind of learning cycle, rather than some scientific observer in a lab coat with a checklist saying, are you doing it correctly, and are we getting the outcomes we want? But then also recognizing that there are some really interesting methodologies to think about the intangibles, what we think really are intangibles, but there are ways of surfacing the things that we have argued that these practices actually promote, right? And so of recognizing relational value of social capital. And I think at a time in the world where it's clear we're almost, we're more polarizing in some countries, we're losing social cohesion in other places, how critical that is to the health of a society, not to mention just the outcomes, and how that's a critical piece of our progress and certainly equality. So yeah, I won't go into the beginning of a whole new book, but I do think it's an area that we're just scratching the surface of, but I think is being provoked by the practices that we've been surfacing.
Yeah, and I think it's rooted in a complexity mindset, which is often, used in systems thinking. But I think we make the mistake sometimes of using the language of complexity to show that we can have certainty, but we can't. So in most cases, in a social change environment, it's a moving target. So because we're learning as we go, it's impossible, if not destructive, to try and define your outcomes in a purely definitive way at the outset of an intervention, because you're going to miss something along the way that's actually the key to the true change and the true world that you want to see at the end. So the idea that you're in a learning cycle and that process outcomes can actually be a truly measurable thing that propels you forward, but ensuring that those are part of the effort. So many of the organizations that we looked at were looking at process outcomes. They were looking at things that were milestones that if they were achieving them along the way, if they were staying together while learning, if they were creating new connections, if they were ensuring that those connections then resulted in a deeper level of introspection on the part of individuals, if they were then seeing that policies were changing because of it, then they knew that they were on the right track. But they were never resting on their laurels saying we achieved that outcome. It was always a process of then cycling that information back so that it could be used for the next wave of change. So I think it's the complexity mindset that allows us to really look at this and say, we're not trying to just kind of say it can't be measured at all. In fact, what we're saying, it's the process that needs to be measured, not the outcomes.
So the other point I wanted to bring in, and that below the level of principles, we haven't really come to it, but we've kind of started to talk about it. There is this set of practices, and just wanted to share with you and your audience. You've seen it, Winthrop, but actually we've tried to make it not only storytelling and research-based and case-based and speaking to experts, but also quite practical in a way that we've looked at what are the practices and tactics that speak to, promoting platforms, cultivating collectives, equipping problem solvers, and disrupting these policies and patterns in ways that are, here's actually what happened. We call it systems work. This is the work. And so while we are having a little bit of a conceptual conversation, there are some very practical ways that these organizations go about doing this work. It's not, in some ways it has been quite intuitive because it is people who are really understand the context they're in and understand what they've had to build in order to achieve the goals they wanted. But it's when we started to look at it, we saw there are sets of practices that were actually relatively consistent in what they were doing. And so the end of each chapter in the book has a set of learning notes, and we kind of unpack the case studies, some of which people know well, like Mothers to Mothers, but see through a different lens, as well as others that perhaps are less familiar that hopefully people will learn from.
I know our time is nigh. Is there anything else you would like to add about the book that we haven't covered that you think is relevant?
No, I think it's one of those things where we take a deep dive into a couple of things, and then we're really just excited to continue the conversations. You finish writing a book, and the moment you finish it, you wish you had written a few other things. So it's about starting the conversation, about carrying the conversation forward. It's a moment in time, and it was certainly an interesting moment in time to finish writing a book right in the middle of a global pandemic. We feel like we're continuing to learn. We know that the organizations that we spent time with are carrying these learnings forward and are continuing to learn themselves. It's just wonderful to be in a conversation, and we thank you for allowing us to do that with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you both.
Thanks, Winthrop. Yeah, it's really been a privilege to be able to share the story of others. And I think what we're hearing is this kind of affirmation of work that is being done. And I think that's what we all need to do is create the space to allow organizations to share the work that they might be doing more of if we trusted them, if we resourced them around these practices. So hope that can really help your audience. We're really open to connecting, certainly with people, donors, and anyone who is, I guess, grappling with these issues like we all have been, and where we're but we're very hopeful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I certainly do hope that our viewers participate in this conversation after they see this and that they read the book. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Winthrop.
Thanks, Winthrop.